So moving on to Dr. Inger Jonnson from University of Uppsala. Dr. Jonnson.
Yes, and it will be no interesting figures or illustrative pictures, but some keywords that at least hopefully will keep me on track what I'm going to talk about. In my presentation, I will give some reflections on gender and impact assessment in the research systems. And this is something that has been touched upon by several previous speakers. The background for my interest is, as working at the Swedish Council for Working Life and Social Research in Sweden, which is my main employer actually, I took part in the European Science Foundation MO4 on evaluation, and particularly in a working group on impact studies. But although we didn't talk that much about gender perspectives in that setting, but I am bringing with me as a social scientist, and I'm also an active researcher at the University of Uppsala, a gender perspective. So I will talk a little about context, about assessing science for science, and the new trend, assessing science for society and policy. And I will end with saying something about gender and impact assessment. This quotation, I think, captures very well the increased focus on impact that will set the scene for my presentation. And so if my research is successful, where might it have an impact? How am I going to make sure that happens, that it will have an impact? The trend that is a part of an ongoing transformation of the research systems, a transformation that has been characterized in different ways, but with some, I think, commonly identified features, such as a growing interest in what society can benefit from science in terms of, for example, sustainable growth, better health, etc. We heard it in this morning. There are also, of course, very high hopes that science can and will contribute by addressing the grand challenges. And, as has also been mentioned, this trend is interwoven with an increased focus on excellence. One strand in this development has been linked to the new public management, with key elements such as transparency, accountability. I'm sure all of you have heard this expression, the audit society. There is talk about value for money, returns for public investment in research. And to account for this, to measure this, impact assessment has come to be regarded as a useful method, or useful methods in plural. The most common methods for assessing science are used primarily for assessment focusing on scientific impact, but also for assessing impact on society. And I'm sure you all are familiar with this, very familiar. Peer review, commonly used for assessing applications for research funding, but also for assessing articles for scientific journals. And one aspect that has been highlighted is, of course, the central role of peer reviewers as gatekeepers in this system. Another method that has become to have a more and more important role is bibliometrics, publications and citations indexes. And it's used also for different purposes, but it has been more and more become an indicator of excellence. And this is methods that are short, they have a lot of shortcomings, and they have been very much debate concerning them. How are they neutral? Can we trust them? Are they sufficient to account for excellence in different research fields, etc.? And there are several studies that look at this from a gender perspective, but they seem to be a bit inconclusive. They are looking at gender biases or gender imbalances in both peer review and bibliometrics. They seem to point in different directions. It could depend on national context for the studies, disciplinary differences. But there are also some meta-analyses looking at studies from different countries, and also they seem to point, they are a bit inconclusive. So as a researcher, now I'm talking as a researcher, I would like to see more studies. I would like to see more studies looking into this. But of course, I do agree with speakers yesterday that emphasized that we do have a lot of knowledge already, and it's time for action. There is time for evidence-based action, of course, but maybe more studies can help us to calibrate our tools for the actions better. And if we know more about is there a bias or not, there is also the question how to explain this gender bias. And one way to proceed with this might be more qualitative studies. There have been some, but I think there could be more, that acknowledge the importance of the dynamics in review panels. It was mentioned yesterday. And also look at excellence as a boundary object, a concept open for negotiations. And in this context, I would like to mention an interesting pilot study undertaken by the Swedish Research Council, which is the main funding organization in Sweden for basic research, where specially trained gender observers have been sitting in at panel meetings, closely observing the process. What is going on? How are the panel members talking about female and male applicants? And the report on this, and it's a pilot that will be followed up with new it will be expanded. It's only in Swedish, but maybe we can try to get the Research Council to have a version in English as well. What then about science for society and policy? There is a growing interest in this, and it has become more and more important, not only as a part of quality assessment of research, but also as a basis for the distribution of funding to the universities. It's already planned in some countries and suggested as a future possibility in other countries, for example in Sweden, although very vaguely, but there is a suggestion. And if we look at, as we did in this ESF MO4 I talked about, impact assessment studies that has been done, you can see there is an immense focus on methods. And methods that can capture what science means for society, from cost-benefit analysis, econometrics, to the elaborated payback model and other qualitative approaches that make use of case studies and are more focusing on pathways to impact rather than impact in itself. And this isn't surprising because there are many, I would say, a mountain of challenges that meet you if you want to capture societal impacts of research. In this process, research councils often have a central role as sort of intermediaries that are supposed to implement research policies concerning impact assessment. But it's also very important to pay attention to the external consultants, because the actual assessment process, the actual assessment are often carried out by external consultants. A discussion of what effect the assessment might have on the organizations that are being subject for the assessment is seldom visible in the reports. This is, however, I will argue, something that should be highlighted, as evaluations are always interventions that have effects on the organization and individuals that are being assessed. And one example, one exception, is maybe the following recommendation for organizations involved in the upcoming quality assessment in the UK, where societal impact will be a new and vital part. The organizations, the university are supposed to find good examples of societal impact. And I quote, "It is equally important that universities are able to consider strategies for managing the implications of the REF associated selection and implementation process on their talent pool and research activity." So here is sort of thought of that it might have an effect. So if we combine this with the knowledge we have, as we've heard both yesterday and today, the knowledge we do have, that universities, like other organizations, are gendered, and that the meritocratic system interacts most often in subtle ways with other factors such as gender. And research has furthermore shown how seemingly gender-neutral interventions into gendered organizations might result in gendered outcomes. So I would repeat what is said in a recent European Commission report focusing on structural change in research organizations. New policies need to be assessed whether they will have an effect on men and women in different ways. So, to conclude, and this was my aim with this presentation, I would like to call attention to the importance of gender being on the agenda when planning impact assessment of societal benefits of research, this new and important trend, of course, as well as concerning science for science assessment. And it should really be discussed in relation to things like the planning, the assumed logics of the assessment model, the methods used, and the expected outcomes. And not the least in relation to possible effects on organizations and individuals that are subject for this assessment. What will it mean for career tracks, for becoming employed, for wage setting, for the status as a researcher, if you are also going to be assessed concerning what impact on society your research will have? So I hope we will keep an open eye for this, and it's important to monitor and to critically reflect on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jonnson. So before going on to have a quick and interesting input, I'm sure, on Discover Markets, could we again have one or two quick questions?
Hello, and thank you. I'm Zina Sharman. I'm with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, so the National Health Research Funding Agency in Canada. Thank you for your presentation. I was very interested in your comment about the study using gender observers to observe the review panels. One of the things we're interested in working on within our organization is developing tools for peer reviewers to train them to assess their applications for looking at sex and gender. So, of course, I'm curious about this study and wonder if you can comment on some of the outcomes of this gender analysis, a gender observer project, as well as whether there are plans or you have developed any tools to train your reviewers to better address issues of gender bias as well as sex and gender more broadly. Unfortunately, I'm not really the right person to answer because the study isn't
done at my research council, but a sister organization. I think what they have discovered is that there are differences because it is the main funding organization for basic research. They have panels covering different disciplinary complex, what you say, humanities, yeah. So there are differences between the panels. And if I remember right, there are, in some panels, it's obvious that what factors are considered to be important for the assessment differs if the panel members are talking about male and female applicants. For example, what was talked about yesterday, do babies matters, for one thing. So it's obvious that there are factors influencing the assessment of excellence, because it should really be the excellence of the application and, of course, the competence of the researcher. But and I know the Research Council, they will use this. They will expand it to do it in several panels, and they have trained because they have had external gender experts coming in, but they will train their own personnel to be able to sit in and do this observation. And also they are going to feed it back to the panels. So maybe I can, maybe you can get in contact with some at the Research Council to know more about it. Yeah.
I can maybe add something from my own experience, being a professor at the Karolinska Institute since 25 years back. I always thought that what I discovered in my research was much more important than all these numbers and citation and whatever. But really, actually, rather late in my career, when I started to look up in Web of Science, my citations, and the so-called H factor. And I took it out when discussing with the head of the department and with my colleagues, many of whom are men, and they were immensely impressed. I've never got so much response from them. So I think that the merits and this citation, when you can put down the numbers, the citations, or this H factor, look it up immediately and use it. I think it is a way, at least, of communicating with traditions.